We're going to take a look at when you're purchasing a multifamily property and you're under contract, you might often have what's called a due diligence period. You may not, but let's assume, for purposes of this conversation, you have a due diligence period, which gives you the opportunity for a set number of days to review the property, review the financials, the leases, and we're going to dive into each and every checklist item that I could think of in no particular order on what you want to consider, whether you're buying 2 units or 200 units. It's a very similar process no matter what. For the larger buildings, you might have a professional third-party manager, or if you have in-house management or you're vertically integrated, meaning you have your own property manager on staff. You might get assistance in this process. If it's just you alone buying a 2, 3, 4 unit, this is what you're going to want to focus on yourself. So let's go through this. First that comes to mind is reviewing the actual financials. So you might have received from the seller or from the broker an overview of reported financials, income, and expenses on the property, and it varies what you receive. For a professional brokerage company that's listing a larger property, you're going to have all the financials you need, T12, which means the last 12 months of profit and loss. You might have a T3, you might have the past 2 years, you might have a certified rent roll. The point is you want to get your hands on the actual financials for at least the last 12 months, ideally, just to compare to what your expectations were, make sure there's no inaccuracies from what you received originally to what actually occurred on the building. So you're going to take a look at the financials. If you had if this was an on-market deal from a commercial broker, you might have an offering memorandum or an OM that you received from them. You just want to compare and make sure there's nothing that jumps out. If there is, you can ask questions and validate. The next thing you're going to want to get your hands on is a copy of the rent roll, basically, and all the leases. So you're going to perform a lease audit, where you're going to review each and every page of the lease. Now, that could be you. You could have a third party that handles that for you. One way or another, you're going to want to go through every page carefully to make sure there's no special arrangements, special terms, any concessions, and just make note of all the basic terms of each lease for each unit, and get a feel for how many units will be potentially vacating or turning over by the time you take over ownership. So you're going to make note of all the details from each lease, any special terms. You're going to be looking for any sweetheart deals that might exist. Could be a family member, could be someone that's handling maintenance on the property, could be a really long-term lease, much longer than average. Just want to extract that information and make sure you're prepared for what reality has to offer. Looking for anything odd that might stand out in the lease. You want to get a feel for how does the lease structure when the tenant does move out. Is there a cleaning fee that's automatically charged if they have pets or not? Is there a breakdown on the estimated cost for repairs that they might be responsible for that could be deducted from their security deposit? Just want to get a feel for how thorough the lease is to get a few steps ahead so that when you take over ownership, you're prepared. Ideally, if possible, you get a copy of all the rental applications for the existing tenant base. This way you get a feel for what kind of qualifications did that applicant have at the time. Are they up to your standards? Is something that you might want to factor in upon renewal, that you either have them reapply, or you can decide to terminate a lease if that particular resident didn't meet what your qualifications would have been at that time. Looking for any documents related to subsidized housing. There might be tenants that are on a Section 8 program or some other sort of subsidized housing assistance program. You want to get all paperwork related to that. Is there an individual or company that is responsible for overseeing that? You might have to communicate with them on lease renewals or terminations. You want to verify how much money the subsidized housing agency is providing each month, how much the tenant is paying, and it might pinpoint what they do and do not cover, or what you can and cannot charge when you take over ownership. Ideally, you can get a copy of what's called a delinquency report, get a feel for how many tenants are behind on rent. That could be something that's current today and historical. Ideally, you want to get a feel for the trend. Has there been higher delinquency in the past? Was there lower delinquency in the past and it's trending up? And that would typically be for a third-party managed building of larger size that they can easily access that information on their software. And then you want to make a note of upcoming turnovers. So have tenants given notice to move out so that when you take over, you're prepared for, it could be part of your rehab plan, could just be preparing for your occupancy levels for the first few months of ownership. All right, another thing that is important, and I've learned the hard way over the years, is getting something that's known as the estoppel certificate. You're not going to get this every time, but if you can, basically what this includes will be a breakdown for each and every resident of each unit on what they are paying in rent, what prepaid rent they might have paid, such as last month's rent, or what deposits they have in escrow, whether security deposit or pet deposit, if it's itemized between the two buckets. And the purpose of this is that upon settlement, you are going to want to receive a credit from the seller for any of that prepaid rent and deposits that are in escrow, so that you get those funds at settlement and can then put them in your escrow account. The challenge I've had in the past is I've had tenants that have maybe prepaid last month's rent. Maybe it wasn't specified on the lease, it was a side agreement, or it was on the lease and I didn't verify. And I've cost myself thousands of dollars by purchasing property, not knowing those funds were there. The owner didn't release them at settlement, and when I requested them after settlement, I was told to pound sand. Obviously, you can pursue that in a legal matter, but these are generally small amounts, just a nuisance, but they did add up over time. So the estoppel certificate is a form that you or somebody will itemize what the lease says the tenant has paid, and have the tenant sign that. So the lease terms, the term of the lease, the amount of rent, any additional income that the seller is receiving from that resident, and also prepaid rent and security deposit, pet deposit, very important. The inspection period, so as part of your due diligence, ideally you'll have the ability to inspect the building, and I would highly recommend that you get into each and every single unit interior. Sometimes you'll have an owner that makes up an excuse or says it's not going to be possible to see every unit. Well, those might be the units that you definitely want to see. They could be the worst condition ones, or there could be a story there. So you're ideally going to want to get into the inside of every unit, and while you're in there, just make note of the condition. So as you're formalizing your rehab plan, get a feel for what each and every interior needs, whether it's flooring, paint, plumbing, fixtures, and make note of the age of each of the appliances and any mechanicals, water heaters, furnaces, air conditioners that are in each unit. Does the landlord own those items, or does the tenant own those items? That'll all make a big difference. If they're tenant-owned appliances, for example, you take over ownership, that tenant moves out a few months later, they take the appliances with you, though there's $1,500 or whatever that you weren't budgeting for. So you just want to make sure you itemize those, make note of it in a spreadsheet or in your software program. If possible, have a plumber or a qualified individual do a video scope of the sewer lines, especially if you see large trees that are out in the yard, maybe above where the sewer lines are. That could be a big issue with roots in the sewer lines. Again, it depends on the vintage of the property too. If it's a 2020 build, probably not a concern. If it's a 1950 build, odds are there's going to be some roots or damage or bellying or sinking or cracking of these old pipes. So ideally you can get a video scope of each and every sewer line to the street, because that's the portion that you, at least in my state, you'll be responsible for replacing if needed. Walking the roof, so that could be you, if you know what you're looking for, or a roofer or contractor could use a drone to get a closer look at the flat roof or shingled roof, whatever it might be, and just get a sense for how much age remains, what repairs need to be addressed, how does the flashing look, etc. Electrical panels, there's a couple of different panel brands that might be not ideal in the eyes of the insurance broker, insurance agent. Just want to verify and you probably already did this in your walkthroughs originally before you finalized an offer. I just want to have the panels looked at, see what kind of upgrades are needed, verify is it aluminum wiring or copper, are the outlets grounded, all simple things that an electrician or a qualified inspector or contractor can help verify for you. Updating the budget. So you have this information, you perform your inspections, your walkthroughs, you have an itemization of the age of each of the appliances, who owns what, of the major mechanicals, the roof, the exterior, the interior common areas. Now you can just revisit your budget that you laid out and bring that completely up to speed on what the realistic expectations are, and get your contractors lined up, your crew lined up to get work started as soon as you take over ownership. I'm going to ask the owner for an insurance loss run for the past 5 years. Could be 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever they're willing to reveal. And this will be basically any filed claims through their insurance provider during their ownership period. Why is this important? Well, this might impact the premium that you pay with your insurance provider. Odds are you've already gathered an insurance quote prior to going under contract, but that may not always be the case. So you're going to want to do that during your due diligence. Just make sure the premium that is quoted to you is what you expected and not too far off. The lender, if there is one, will typically perform what's known as a phase one environmental study, and that'll just be looking for any environmental concerns such as buried tanks. If the grounds had a previous use, such as a gas station, there's a gas station nearby, or maybe there was an asbestos plant years ago. All that will be searched for and detailed through that phase one report. If there are issues, it might need then what's called a phase two, which is much more expensive and extensive. More often than not, phase one will show everything's clear, looks good, and you can move forward with confidence. But that'll be something that typically the lender will require. And if they don't, you might want to consider it yourself. There's companies that can handle that for you. Ordering title, pretty obvious, but get the title ordered. You want to see if there's any liens, encumbrances, make sure the seller has all that cleared off. It'll all be part of your typical purchase and sale agreement. And title will oftentimes be overseen by a different contingency in the purchase and sale agreement anyway, but just an obvious, make sure you order your title, any tax and utility certifications, at least in the state of Pennsylvania where I'm at. You'll have the title company or a third-party company will order what's called tax and utility certs, just to verify that the taxes have been paid, what utilities have been paid, what balances are owed on each. Make sure the seller takes care of that on the settlement sheet at closing. Ask the seller for a copy of any municipal certificate of occupancies, inspection reports, are there any violations with the city or town that you're buying in? You want to look for any fire safety inspections, if relevant, for the building that you're buying. If there's an elevator, get a copy of the most recent elevator inspection and get a feel for when you're going to need to perform that again. Usually it's annual. Some municipalities might require a seller to perform an inspection as part of the resale process, the transfer of ownership process, and that municipality might require the seller to make repairs. That should be part of your purchase and sale agreement, and you just want to get a copy of all that documentation when complete. An important element to request from the owner are the service contracts, a copy of service contracts. So what are those? Those are things such as if you have coin-operated laundry, sometimes you'll have a third-party company that maintains those washers and dryers and collects the coins on those, and the owner gets a certain percentage split of the revenue. Third-party company handles all the maintenance. The owner typically pays the utilities for those, but that can be a difficult contract to get out of, with very, very finite time frames that you have to meet if you ever want to get out of that contract. So make a careful note of reviewing those page by page and make a note of when you can get out if needed. If there's any pest control contract, any service, any lawn, snow, trash, janitorial, etc., anything you can think of relevant to that building that you might have a recurring contract that might by default transfer to the new owner, and you may not want that to occur. So getting ahead of that curve. If there's any cable company contracts, anything like that. Want to get a feel, ideally, for the schedule of capital improvements that the current owner has made to the building over, say, the past 5 years, could just be 2 years. You might see a building, not much has been done to it at all. Maybe think a lot has been done, but if you can get a sense for what was done, how much was spent on those, any receipts that they might have, you might not get much, but requesting that gives you, again, a sense of how you're going to need to budget for capital improvements when you take over ownership. But the major thing is you want to get a feel, and you probably would have from your inspections anyway, for the age of the roof, the windows, appliances, major mechanicals. Another way that has cost me over the years is and I mentioned it before, the owner-owned personal property versus tenant-owned personal property. So, for example, the refrigerator. It depends on the building. Every owner operates things differently. They might have refrigerators, they own every single one. There's some cases where they don't supply refrigerators at all, and it's on the tenant to supply those. So you, as the future owner, wants to know with certainty what items will need to be replaced. Potentially, sometimes tenants will leave those items behind, and if they're functional and in good shape, you can just keep them for the next tenant. definitely want to break that down and make an itemized list of each item. If there's any on-site staff, this will be for larger buildings, could be 80 units or above. If there's any on-site leasing staff, maintenance staff, if there's any in-house, like if there's somebody that handles the maintenance or snow removal and lives on site, just want to get all contact information. If there's any contracts, typically those can be terminated when you take over ownership, but sometimes you might want to get a sense for how they're being compensated, what the arrangement is. You might want to keep them on if that makes sense for you when you take over ownership. I mentioned before the tax and utility certifications. This might be state specific, but in Pennsylvania, we just want to verify taxes have been paid, what is owed, same with utilities, and make sure that's all resolved at settlement. Current aged receivables and payables report. Why is that important? It gives you, as the future owner, an idea of what money is owed and to whom, and then what money are you awaiting. And you're going to receive this. You could see in the this is more for vendors. Receivables could be obviously rent owed to you as well, but you just want to get a holistic feel for what might become your responsibility upon taking over ownership. And those reports will give you a breakdown. More often than not, they're going to be resolved prior to settlement, but let's say major CapEx improvement was made, that contractor was not paid, but they haven't filed a lien yet, but you see they're owed $20,000, $30,000 or whatever the case might be. You just want to make sure that you stipulate that that balance is paid in full, have that report rerun prior to settlement and just verify. If there was any work performed, so you have a feel for what work was performed through requesting the CapEx improvements over the past 2 to 5 years, and you might want to verify with the municipality, could be city, township, borough, that were permits pulled for that work. So if the seller doesn't provide you with that information, you might be able to go in and might have a right to know form filled out where you can get a copy of what permits were pulled or not pulled and make sure those permits have been closed, meaning a final inspection was performed and approved. Because if they're not, well, guess whose responsibility that becomes? Obviously yours. And then during your due diligence period, something that you probably already did before was a market survey, a market analysis, when to get a sense for your competition, so visiting the other comparable properties as a prospective tenant, get a sense for what kind of improvements have been made. This is just going to further validate the projected rent that you expect to charge, the quality of the improvements you're planning to make. It might just help you refine that vision for what needs to be done once you take over ownership. You might want to speak with the police department about any crime activity on the building, again, something you might have done before. But just getting a general feel, and if you have a solid broker relationship, they might be able to pull a lot of this comparable market activity for you and give you an idea of what buildings are most comparable to yours. You can also do that through searching online in your own efforts. So that's a pretty thorough list of a variety of items in no particular order that might be relevant, might not be, for when you take over or when you're under contract on your next multifamily purchase. Like I said, it doesn't matter how many units it is. A lot of these items are relevant, whether it's 2 or 200 units. So hopefully that was helpful for you to give you some thoughts for the next time. All right, well, that's it for now. It's Sean Lowry with Timberon Capital. If you want to learn more about our company, feel free to visit our website. Here it is on the screen. And if you want to connect, feel free to do so through the website, and I look forward to connecting. Hope that was helpful.